Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're all very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar on Friday morning. I hope you're all keeping well, and we have another really interesting presentation to look forward to this morning. The main thing to think about today is, I suppose, we're talking about biodiversity again, and with long distinctive legs, bulky body and long decurved bill, the curlew can be found during winter in wetlands and bogs. Unfortunately, curlew numbers have been in decline in recent decades, but what can we do to change this? Flo Blackbourn, manager of Curlew Action, joins us to discuss action now for Curlews Tomorrow. Good morning, Flo. How are you keeping?
Good morning. I'm well, thank you.
Very good, and thanks a million for joining us this morning. And we're also joined by our Teagasc Countryside Management Specialist, Keena, who you all know, who's going to help me out with questions. Keena, how are you keeping today?
Morning all, how are you?
Great, thank you. Flo, maybe just to start off, you might tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are.
Yeah, of course. So I live in Glasgow. I'm originally from Edinburgh. I went up to Aberdeen to study zoology over 10 years ago now, which is a bit scary. And since then, I worked in wildlife rehabilitation for a few years. And working in wildlife rehabilitation, you basically spend the majority of your time with birds of various species. And it made me really interested in birds and wanting to find out more about them. So I then did a couple other jobs for a couple of years. And then a year ago, I did a master's in bird migration. And I found that really interesting and like the birds' movements and knowing where they go. And after that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do bird conservation in some form. And I knew that I wanted, if possible, to study a species which is migratory. And that led me to getting a job as general manager for Curlew Action, which I started just under 6 months ago.
Oh, what's so special about the curlew? What draws your love for the curlew? Because I know I was looking at your website there the last couple of days, and you specifically mentioned it.
They're just beautiful birds, really, and it's something about them. They have a really haunting call, and they feature in folklore. And something about them seems to draw people in. Since I've started working with curlews, so many people surprisingly have said to me, it's almost the curlew that's drawn me into nature, and a lot of people have like a love specifically for the curlew. And I think as well, they're a very special bird because you kind of have to go looking for them. They're not very brightly colored, and you're not going to find them in a city. So a lot of people don't actually know that they exist. When I've told people I work for a curlew charity, I can't believe how many people have said to me, "What's a curlew?" Which for me was unbelievable. I guess probably when I was younger, I didn't know either, but because I'm in a bird world, for me, I just assumed everyone knew what they are. So there's something very special about the curlew's call, and I think there's something very distinctive about it. It almost brings back memories of years and years ago when we used to hear more of them. And I think for a lot of people, they do remind them of years gone by.
Yeah, I think you couldn't have set this presentation up any better. So with that, we'll let you kick off.
Yeah, so talking to you about Curlews today, talking about the charity that I work for, Curlew Action. Also, we'll talk to you generally about curlews and the risks they face and what we can do to help them. So many of the stats I'm going to be talking about today concern the UK, but I have also tried to find some for Ireland as well. So I do include more information specific to Ireland as well. So first of all, I wanted to give you some quick facts about the curlew. Unless otherwise stated, I'm talking about the Eurasian curlew here. So there are a few species around the world, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's the Eurasian curlew that which we're generally talking about day to day. And these are the ones which we get in the UK and in Ireland, Numenius arcuata. So they're Europe's largest wader with a wingspan of up to about a metre wide. They're a migratory species. I've already said that's why I love them so much, amongst other things. The ones which breed in the UK, they often overwinter in Ireland, Spain, France, and Portugal. Mainly, it would be Ireland and France. Interestingly, though, the curlew which breed in Ireland tend to stay in Ireland, with a few going to France, but for some reason they seem to prefer to stay in country. The curlew and the whimbrel, as you can see here, are often confused for one another, and whimbrel actually does come under the curlew umbrella. But if you're looking at both of them side by side, it's a bit harder if you're looking at them, on their own. The whimbrel is a little bit smaller, they're more compact and a bit less stocky than the curlew, and they've got this more prominent eye stripe, also known as a supercilium. They have shorter beak, and some people describe the beak curvature as being a bit less uniform than the curlews, which you can really see if you see them kind of side by side. I think a good way of describing it for me is that the whimbrel looks a bit more cartoonish than the curlew, in my opinion, anyway. But curlews mate for life. and they're very faithful to their site and, as I say, to their mate as well. The chicks are precocial, which means that, like ducklings, when they hatch, they're quite not fully independent, but they can get up, walk around. They're covered in down. They're not bold, staying in the nest and completely helpless. They can forage for themselves very early on. And once fledged, adults will typically live for about 11 years. So adult survival is quite high, with about 32 years old being the oldest recorded curlew, and possibly even older in unrecorded. So the real issue for curlews is fledging and getting them to fledging stage. That's where the conservation concern really lies. We officially have 8 species of curlew around the world. It was officially 9, although some people don't split the two whimbrels, the Hudsonian whimbrel. But if you do, then it was 9. However, in November 2024, the slender-billed curlew was declared extinct, not having been seen since 1995. And one of our former trustees was actually part of the official search for the slender-billed curlew, but unfortunately they haven't been found. The Eskimo curlew is also the one that's considered likely to go extinct next, although that's not official yet, which is a bit strange because actually the last confirmed sighting of the slender-billed curlew was not since the 60s. So actually you'd think that they're more likely to be extinct than the slender-billed, but at the moment they are still kind of officially around, but probably not actually around, unfortunately. So there are a lot of threats to the curlew. As I said, they mainly concern getting chicks to fledging stage. Like other ground nesting birds and waders, they suffer from all these problems here. So changing landscapes I've put into one. I had separated them before, but I put them together because this really concerns different ways in which our landscapes are changing. A curlew pair in England, though, needs to fledge about 1 chick every other year for there to be a sustainable population. But at the moment, the average around Europe is about half of this. So starting on egg and chick predation, many people consider predation to be the biggest risk to curlews when it comes to their nests. And in recent decades, nest failure in ground nesting birds and in curlews has gone up and chick survival down. But actually, in this study, it was found that adult survival hasn't changed. So again, that just backs up the idea that the issue isn't adult survival, it's getting these chicks to fledging. They have threats from many sources. Eggs and chicks can be predated by birds like crows and other corvids, mammals like foxes. You can see this picture on the bottom left here of a fox caught on a trail cam by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. According to them, in some parts of England, the main predator of curlew nests is foxes, so they're the main risk. And we have a lot of these generalist predators, which can be a big risk to these ground nesting birds, not just curlew. Another issue is trampling from sheep and cows, and also sheep will sometimes actually eat the eggs as well. But landowners and farmers can be a huge part of the solution as well. So I'll talk more about this later, but there's certainly a lot that can be done about these things. So onto changing landscapes. I've got 2 slides here to separate the kind of 2 ways in which our landscapes are changing. So curlews are greatly reliant on the type of landscapes which are prone to human activities, whether that be development or farming. So they are very much coming into close contact with us and what we're up to. We've had years of wetland draining. The UK has lost 90% of its wetlands in the last 100 years, and I found a figure for Ireland which says that Ireland's lost about 260,000 hectares between 1990 and 2018, so we're losing a lot of our wetlands. And then the use of pesticides, this along with wetland draining is really affecting insect abundance, which is very important for chicks, and also adults feeding on invertebrates as well. When the ground is drier, the invertebrates travel down in the soil and it's harder for them to feed themselves. On farms, there's also issues such as early or frequent cutting for silage. This can destroy nests and it can destroy their habitat. Right from the pre-laying phase all the way to fledging curlews, they need about 3 months to be able to rear their chicks safely without any sort of disturbance, like I've mentioned above. Uniform cutting of fields can also be an issue, so they need a mosaic of habitats where they have tall grasses to hide behind and within, and then the short areas for their actual foraging. But if a field is cut so it's all the same level, either it's too tall grass or too short grass, and they don't get that kind of mosaic which they require. And then we have other types of land use change, which is development on grassland. This can be houses, businesses, things like wind farms. Wind farm sites have been found to be linked to fewer curlews nesting in the area and also lower success in curlews. It's been found that it affects them worse directly after a wind farm's been built and when it becomes operational. But it seems that in subsequent years, as the years go by, it doesn't affect them so badly. It's more just kind of immediately after construction. However, obviously, wind farms themselves can pose a risk to birds and to bats, and there is a collision risk. I think one study I looked at found that about 16% of migrating curlews are at risk from wind farms. I think an issue is just, as I've said already, grassland is very poorly protected and it's very threatened as well. I think that's because it provides a potential for development. So it's very hard to get protection when there's always development plans going on, and it might be that this bit of grassland would be perfect for this next project or new houses or whatever it may be. And it's also very important to acknowledge the issue of afforestation as well. Curlews can't nest in forests and they harbour predators. They also won't tend to nest even within about half a kilometre of a forest. So if you think of a forest, say a kilometre by a kilometre, it's not just that area that curlews then can't nest in, it's then half a kilometre all the way around on every side as well. So it kind of gives an issue even larger than the size of the forest itself, and they can really suffer from these predators coming out of these forests. And then we also have the things that come with development, like roads. These are a risk, whether it be collisions or them nesting too close to a road and things like that. In England especially, they nest a lot in airfields because these are wide expanses of grass area where often they're fenced in so predators can't get in. So in theory, it's ideal nesting for curlews, but they have collision risks, so they often end up having to be killed, which is why I'll mention in a few minutes, head starting has been a solution to this, and which is very much involved with airfields in England. So there are many, many ways in which we disturb waders, ground nesting birds, curlews, whether we want to or not during the nesting season and also in winter. And the vast majority of these are completely unintentional. With the best will of the world, we're doing it without even knowing we're doing it sometimes. Ground nesting birds are very flighty, as you can imagine, and flushing them can alert predators to where their nests are. So even if the bird itself is fine, the chicks are sitting tight, a predator can then be alerted to something going on there. There's a bird sitting there, maybe there's a nest. In winter, brief disturbances such as walking too close to colonies or letting your dog run through colonies may seem harmless, but this kind of thing can happen again and again and again over the course of a day. And many individuals causing brief disturbance can lead to the birds having stress. It can lead to weight loss, either as a result of the stress or reduced feeding because they're having to be vigilant more of the time, looking around to see what's going on. And in extreme circumstances, this can lead to death, especially if you consider in winter, the conditions aren't as good, there might be less food, and they've probably just done a big migration or about to do a big migration. So they really need to be in as good a condition as possible. And then they can also suffer from carryover effects, whereby if they're weaker in winter, they're then weaker in spring, and they're less likely to be successful when they're trying to rear their young. So it's a bit like a vicious cycle, really. And yeah, dogs can predate them and flush them from their nest. One study found that even though a lot of people walking their dogs, if they accidentally disturbed a nest or even picked up a bird, the owners would believe that it was an accident and that the dog had just stumbled across the nest. But one study, I can't remember where it was, but it was somewhere abroad, found with aerial cameras that actually, with some breeds of dog, when they went into these areas, they actually started moving in like a zigzag pattern. They were basically searching at that point. So when they found the bird or they found the nest, it wasn't actually an accident at all. It was very much an intentional kind of hunting by that dog. But for the owner, obviously, there's not really any way you're going to know that. And then other ways we disturb them is things like drones. I've seen colonies disturbed by drones, which go down to film them, ironically, and completely scatters them everywhere. Get the problem with seal holeouts as well. It's quite a big issue, actually. And then things like water sports as well, like in winter when these birds are in estuaries and people get too close to them from the water's edge, that can have an impact as well. So on a climate change vulnerability scale, curlews have been rated as a very high risk, which means they suffer greatly from climate change. And these can be the two extremes, drought on one end and flooding on the other. So drought obviously leads to poor insect abundance for the young to feed on and worse foraging for adults, as I said about the invertebrates. Crane fly are a really important part of the diet for the chicks, and crane fly larvae die in hot temperatures. It can also lead to dehydration. If they're not feeding on insects, then they might be dehydrated if they don't, because a lot of these birds get their hydration from the food that they eat rather than always going to drink water. And this can obviously lead to death if they're too dehydrated. Adult stress, heat stress, sorry, also can lead to nest abandonment. So if an adult's sitting there in direct sunlight, no shade at all, because they're obviously nesting in open areas, and they get too hot, they will just leave the nest because they don't have a choice. There has, as a result of this, been an upward shift in curlew distribution found, which is likely a result of these drier, warmer conditions. They're trying to get to slightly cooler conditions where it's a bit better for them. And then marine invertebrate life cycles are affected by the changing temperatures. So again, in winter, if they're not feeding as well, this can then affect their nesting in the breeding season. And then on the other extreme, as I said, is flooding. Curlews do benefit from wetlands, of course, but only up to a point. If an area gets too flooded, the nest, the chicks, the eggs can actually get washed away. And also, if there are chemicals used in the area nearby, it can just like wash chemicals, pollutants into the area where they're nesting, which is a risk for them as well. So I'm talking about the UK now, but then I have a slide about Ireland in a second. But the UK has about 58,500 breeding pairs of curlew. This is about 20 to 25% of the population globally. So it's a very important population that we have in the UK, but there's been nearly a 50% decline in the last 26 years and more than a 50% decline in Scotland and Wales. There's also been a decline in the number of wintering. This could be a mix of conditions or disturbance in the UK, but it might also be because of poor fledging elsewhere in further north where these birds are then migrating to the UK from. So they're now on the red list in the UK, and they're considered one of the greatest conservation concerns here. A few years ago, I said before that we're only fledging half what we need to fledge, which sounds bad, but I think this sounds even worse, which is that for a stable population in the UK, we'd need to be fledging 10,000 more chicks every single year, which is a big kind of gap to try and fill. Unfortunately, in Ireland, the situation's even worse. Curlews are also on the red list, and without dramatic intervention, many consider that they'll be extinct in Ireland as a breeding bird within the next few decades. So there's really a lot to be done. This map here shows the area where curlews used to be and where they were found to be in a 2008 to 2011 census. You can see they've been lost from many areas. In the 1980s, they're estimated to be around 3,500 to 12,000 breeding pairs of curlew in Ireland. Now there are only 95, so there's been a dramatic decline. And you can see here that Wader Tales have described it as being the equivalent of, this is 2019, so a little bit different in terms of the numbers, but equivalent to the Republic dropping from 4.8 million to less than 200,000, which I think really puts this into perspective. But it's not all doom and gloom. Something can be done, many things can be done, in fact, and farmers and landowners play a huge part of this, whether it be actually getting involved in the conservation directly or even just giving permission for their land to be used for things like monitoring or conservation projects or, you know, putting up fencing, etc. There's a lot that can be done thanks to landowners. So I've talked about wetland draining and pesticide use being an issue. And obviously these things are done or have been done for a reason. So it's understandable that it's not just as simple as saying, oh, we'll undo those things. But there's other things that can be done instead of that. There are things like setting aside land if you have fields that you don't need to use all the time. These areas then could be free of pesticide use. You can dig scrapes which collect water. This helps with insect abundance, which doesn't then just mean more insects in the immediate vicinity. It can then mean more insects, you know, slightly further afield as well. Curlews do prefer wetlands to dry land, so having these wet areas, which is good for the insect, is also good for the curlews. And not even just curlews, you know, it helps a whole host of wildlife. Any sort of nature-friendly farming initiative will help nature as a whole, which is very important. It's not just about the curlew or not just about the ground nesting birds. Grasses in these places, whether in the set-aside land or in other parts of the farm, or, you know, land if it's not a farm, can be grasses can be cut to different lengths. So as I said, the kind of mosaic of habitats. And in Cumbria, they actually trialled a project where they used sheep to do this. They put sheep in a field and they grazed, and then the field was actually then perfect for curlews. I think they then took the sheep out before the curlews started nesting, but either way, it was kind of a good way of keeping the two together. And actually, there are ways of having both in the field at the same time, which can work as well. So even though overgrazing can be an issue, undergrazing can also be an issue. So again, it's about having that balance, really. And then things that can be avoided is, like I've mentioned, avoiding the early cutting of fields or the frequent cutting of fields, especially before like mid-July. Whether for conservation purposes or industry, it's also good to be careful of where people are planting trees and planting hedges, because as I've said, curlews won't tend to nest within about 500 meters of forest. And many farmers and landowners already carry out predator control. It's considered that predation of generalist predators is a huge issue for these ground nesting birds. And again, it's not just curlews, it's other species as well. So with few curlews in Ireland, it's difficult really to kind of carry out all of these actions to help curlews because they tend to be site faithful. So if you don't have a curlew on your farm, it's unlikely next year you will, especially with the way the numbers are going. So curlews may not be present, but as I've said, having nature-friendly farming is obviously good for nature of all types, and curlews will benefit from more of an abundance of insects, as will other species. If curlews fare better in the future, then having these sites which are ready for them means that a curlew that is, for whatever reason, looking for a new nest site will then be able to use that land. So it's definitely worth doing, even if curlews aren't there at that exact moment. The headline at the bottom here, Curlew Conservation Advice for Farmers, is an RSPB article that you can find online. And there's also Curlew Country, which has a few articles about what farmers can do to help curlews. And I've had a quick look at the web pages and they look really helpful. So if anyone wants to have a look at them, I would advise looking at Curlew Country. And then we've got head starting, which is a tactic which involves collecting eggs, often from areas in which they wouldn't survive if they were left, like I've mentioned, airfields. And then these chicks are reared and released into the wild from captivity. This is done around Europe. There are various projects in England. It's done in Ireland, Poland, Germany, Belgium. England has kind of like the largest projects, as I said, working with airfields. That's quite a big thing. But head starting is still very much in its infancy and a lot is still to be learned about it. There are other countries in Europe, such as France, which are considering starting head starting as well. But it's not as simple as just you're losing curlews, we need to do head starting. You need to kind of think about the ins and outs of it and what it will achieve and what else is being done in the background as well. Unfortunately, an issue for Ireland is that there's more capacity than there are eggs present. So they're looking for ways to be able to head start more chicks than they actually have available to them. And it's difficult because how do you get eggs into Ireland for them to be head started? It's great that they have more capacity, but it's a shame that they don't have the eggs to be reared. So this gets them over the main risk in their life, their biggest hurdle, which is getting to fledging. But it's very important to be mindful of the fact that it is just a sticking plaster. Head starting isn't a solution in its own right, but it buys you time while a solution is found. And obviously there is some detriment to the chicks. When those chicks are then released, they don't have any of the survival skills which the wild born ones and the wild rear ones which will have. So adult survival is high, and once they've fledged, they're likely to survive. But the first few days after being released, that's when mortality risk, I would probably say, is the highest because they're in the wild for the first time and they might not know, exactly what they need to do. But they do take care when they're rearing them to try and give them as many sort of lessons, if you like, as they can. So now in terms of protecting nests, this can be done in various ways. Fencing is one method. This can either be fencing of a whole field where curlews or other birds are nesting, or fences that are just around the nests. I think generally fences that are just around the nest are preferred. These can be electric fences. These tend to work better than non-electric fences. But as you can imagine, they're only really effective against mammals, so foxes, not so much for predators, which can fly over the nest, obviously. Also, it does get them to hatching stage, but then within a few days, these chicks will be wandering around and leaving the fenced area. So then they're obviously at risk again. But it does improve hatching success and prevents egg predation, or at least, stops predators, mammalian predators from getting in. And yeah, as for birds, not so much. So I've already mentioned predator control. There are a high number of mesopredators in the UK, and ground nesters are a great risk of them. And another way of protecting nests is if you yourself are a dog walker, just being really mindful of where your dog goes when it's nesting season, so between like April, March and July. But you also might be just a walker, a jogger, you might have children with you that are running around. So just about being mindful of where they are going, where you're going, and whether you're spooking these birds and disturbing them. If you're a dog walker, you obviously just keep your dog under control. If you own the land, you can put up signs or speak to people in the area, just in a very friendly manner, obviously, just saying, oh, just to be aware, there are birds nesting here, or putting up signs like this one of ours featured here, just so that people understand their responsibilities. And then there are things like monitoring and research to help curlews. Much curlew research is focusing on things at the moment, present issues like the causes of crumbling eggshells in curlews, Head starting, as I say, it's very much in its infancy, so we're still looking at what works, what doesn't work, and why. The various projects around Europe have slightly different methods, so they can, talk about this is what I did and this is what my success rates are, and this is what I did, blah blah blah. So just really looking into what works so that maybe in future there'll be more of a standard practice for head starting. And then other things that are being looked at into are what chicks are eating, what food they're requiring, the effect of heat stress on chicks, because we understand a bit more in adults, but less so in chicks. And we've also got things like ringing curlew, GPS tagging them, so we know their longevity, we know where they're going, we know if head started chicks are behaving like wild rear chicks or not. So we know, yeah, when they're coming back, when they're breeding, etc., etc. We have a page on our website, you'll see on the bottom right here, with scientific papers. So we do post quite a lot of the more recent findings in curlew conservation. And then the top right here, Curlew Cam. These show constant activity on the nest from as soon as that nest is found until they wander away from the nest, I suppose. So this will show you parental behavior, what they're doing and when, the parents switching in and out of incubating. And it also shows what disturbs them and what predates them. It's not always obvious with disturbance if it's happening off camera, but certainly if the nest is predated, you'll see what is predating them, which is how the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust were able to conclude that foxes were a big issue for the curlews in that part of England they were looking at. So this leads me on to what we do, which I'll speak about just now. These photos show a bit of a variation of the kind of things we do. So we have like competitions and we run stalls and we partner with like art shows. I have World Curlew Day, which is the 21st of April. We do events with well-known people like the singer David Gray. We value the importance of telling people what curlews are, because as I said, not everyone knows, and talking to people about what affects curlews, because many people, if you're not going to know what a curlew is, you're never going to care about what's affecting them, because you just don't even know that all this is going on. So it's really important to just get people talking, not just about curlews, but about nature as a whole. So as for what we do as a charity, well, we're not field workers, but we bring together field workers and we bring together stakeholders from various backgrounds, conservationists, farmers, landowners, members of the public, anyone who loves curlews, anyone who doesn't know what a curlew is, just everyone we can possibly get together to talk about curlews if we can. We aim to inspire people about the natural world, and we do that often through the lens of the curlew, because we think that's a really good way of getting into nature, as so many people have gotten into nature seemingly through the curlew. The reason we focus on the curlew, there are various reasons. I could say the most simple one is that our director fell in love with curlews and found them a fascinating bird, and she realised how much they were struggling and wanted to help them. But curlews are also bioindicators, so they're very sensitive to their environment, and they're an umbrella species, so they're affected by many of the same things that affect other species. Therefore, if we conserve the curlew, we're conserving the various habitats that they use, because they use a range of habitats. We're conserving the other species that use those habitats, not even just birds, but also mammals and plants as well. We're conserving wetlands, we're conserving grasslands. So they're a great, as I said, umbrella species to conserve everything that uses the land with them, or even the land itself. They're also rather an uncontroversial species, so it's quite easy to get people behind the conservation of the curlew, which then has wider benefits. And as I say, in helping them, we help so much more as well. Personally, I think that it's important to tell people about the curlews as well, because as I said before I started my presentation, you don't often see them and they're not brightly coloured, and you're not going to see them in your town or city. So it is easy not to know about them. And I'm saying I can't believe some people haven't heard of them, but then why would you have heard of them? If you don't know about them, you're not going to know about them. So I think it's important to talk about them because they're struggling, but so many people don't even know they exist. So what we do as a charity, as I said, we bring together stakeholders. So we help other people and experts to meet and collaborate from various backgrounds. We held a workshop in 2024 in February, bringing European field workers together. These are from all around Europe, about over 100 people we had at this event. These are not people who would usually be the focus of a workshop or be able to come together and collaborate. So this was a really important event, and one which we had a lot of positive feedback for. It means that all these different field workers from around Europe were able to learn from each other and learn that they were doing things, sometimes in slightly different ways, so that they're able to can collaborate and then keep the conversations going afterwards. But also, even just in terms of mental health, they learned that the way they felt about things and the way they worried about the future was actually the way that many other people felt. Because a lot of the time, especially as field workers often go out on their own and do things on their own, you can kind of feel a bit lonely. And these people were able to come together and say, oh, I also feel that. I'm also worried about this. And we had that as feedback after the workshop, that people felt it really valuable to be able to come together and talk about those things. This year in February, it's always February, we seem to have our annual workshops. We had an online head starting workshop this year. So a few projects around Europe presented, in fact, all the head starting projects around Europe, I believe, presented on what they do, and they got to come together. And for a lot of the smaller projects, especially, they commented that they learned things from the larger projects. And I'd like to think the larger projects also learn things from the smaller projects. They got to see different practices. There were a lot of questions asked, both by members of the public who wanted to go out of interest and by other people doing head starting, and people as well who thought they maybe wanted to do head starting and wanted to find out a bit more about it. We had a lot of discussions, and we also had anonymous voting so that people could say without fear of being judged, this is how I do this, or this has worked or hasn't worked. Because it's important to talk about the failures as well as to talk about what works. So that was a really important part of what we did. And as a result of it, and as a result of the feedback we've had since, we're planning on now having a yearly head starting webinar so that all these people can come together once a year and talk about how the year went, and again, share tactics and ideas and lessons learned. Where possible, we make these events accessible or either cheaper or free for people who require it to be, so that where possible, anyone can attend, which is why the fieldworker workshop last year was in hybrid format, and the head starting workshop this year was online, so that we can have as many people involved as want to be. We also hold free monthly webinars on all sorts of issues. So we use the Curlew kind of to discuss these wider issues, such as here, managing the uplands. That's not just about curlews, but they also, curlews are part of that. So they kind of bring curlew enthusiasts into the fold. And we bring experts together who give presentations, but then who can also have discussions and again, kind of collaborate in that space and often keep the conversations going afterwards. So we've had people come together which haven't necessarily spoken to each other before. We also have Europe-wide end of breeding season webinars every year where people from Europe come together and talk about how the season went. We have people with all different viewpoints join. Because it's free, we hope that people from every kind of perspective will come, and some people will feel one way about a topic and some people will feel the other way, but everyone's there to say their piece and to ask their questions. And it's then posted on YouTube for anyone to watch who wishes. We keep the topics light sometimes. We'll talk about things like curlews and folklore, like just kind of interesting. But then we also have heavier debates, like we have pro and anti-predator control. We talk about wider issues in conservation. We talk about the mental health aspect. We just kind of delve into everything through the lens of the curlew. We really want to be a place as a charity where people from all backgrounds can have important conversations and be heard, and also where we can be the broker of the difficult conversations as well. So we raise awareness not just about curlews, but about the natural world. As I said, that can be done quite well through the curlew or through the lens of the curlews. As curlews are a wonderful bird, they do bring a lot of people into enthuse about the natural world. They're a great gateway for our appreciation of nature. So we raise awareness about the things that the average member of the public can do something about, the things like the wintering disturbance, the nesting disturbance, and the dog walking. And we do this by writing blogs, and we'll do articles, and Mary often does interviews, like, externally to the charity. We have competitions. We have World Curlew Day competitions, art competitions, poetry competitions, baking. If anyone wants to enter any of them, you're very welcome. The closing date's the 10th of April. You can find out more on our website. We also let people download signs and sell signs. The signs have been designed by our supporters, which we have competitions for. So we really try and get people involved. And we give talks about the issues facing curlews. Often, depending on who's asking us to give the talk, we'll tailor it to what they want us to talk about. But we also just keep the conversation going. Every single day we're working towards curlews, talking about curlews, and we're keeping curlews on the brain, making people think about curlews every day or about nature every day. We also do a lot of work with our Patreon ambassador, as I said, the singer, David Gray. He's great because not only is he really passionate about nature, but he helps us reach a general audience. Fans of his aren't necessarily all into nature, but they'll come along to see him and see him talk. And then through that, we have an audience who wouldn't otherwise come to an event about conservation, get to find out more and get to find out about the curlew. We actually made a short film with him at the beginning of the year, which has been posted on our YouTube, so you can have a look at that if you're interested. Many charities help curlew alongside other birds, but we see ourselves as very much leading on community engagement and raising awareness about curlews. And then we support curlew conservation. We've supported Curlew Country's Head Starting project by providing them with resources in the past. And by bringing conservationists together, we're helping them to gain insights from each other. We support Plant Life's Grassland Action Plan to give grasslands more protection. Our director is the chair of the Curlew Recovery Partnership, which organises gathering data to inform the government department DEFRA, so Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and new environmental schemes for ground nesters. And they do that with farmer clusters, landowners, volunteers, conservationists, etc. We also visit projects abroad to find out the similarities and difference between the issues curlews are facing here and there. We're involved in the creation of a draft UK Curlew Action Plan to better protect them. Unfortunately, schemes to protect curlews do seem to be quite lacking at the moment. And in the future, we hope to have more capacity to help people on a case-by-case basis. And finally, we promote general nature education because we believe that nature can't be helped if people don't know that it needs help, but will never want to help nature if they don't care about it in the first place. So this scary photo, I'd say on the left-hand side, has some rather worrying statistics about children's knowledge of the natural world. And Curlew Action was the main driver behind the Natural History GCSE. This is the main qualification in England and Wales for 14 to 16-year-olds. This has just been reconfirmed after previous confirmation a few years ago and then backtracking, but we're now expecting this to be implemented in the next couple of years. It's been an uphill battle. The director of Curlew Action started in 2011, and now finally it seems that I can end on a positive of this talk, that the GCSE has been confirmed again and should help children learn more about nature in the coming years, but we're not finishing there. We think that we still need to do more about nature education. It's not just about a GCSE. So thanks very much for listening. Apologies, I think I might have gone slightly over time. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Follow us on socials. You can sign up to our newsletter here on the QR code or have a look at the link. And also, very quickly, lastly, this is a great document I found which our director and Teagasc were involved in the creation of, which is about helping curlews in Ireland.
That was really excellent and interesting, super interesting, and your timing was perfect. So thank
Oh,
you very
good.
much for that. Yeah, it was excellent. Thank you. Look, it's obvious you're doing a huge amount of work in trying to help our curlews and save them, and it's great to see. I suppose just to bring it back a little bit to our own issues here in Ireland. I have a note written down here in the UK. You have greater than 25% of the breeding pairs in the UK, and a fairly large number of bird breeding pairs over there. But we have only 95, and we're not that far away from each other. What happened, or what did we do wrong, or?
I think I don't know the exact answer to exactly what happened, but I know certainly that hunting of curlews was legal for a lot longer in Ireland than it was in the UK. So I think it became illegal in 1981 here, but I think it was 2012. I think I put it on the slide in Ireland. So that will probably have had an effect. It's amazing the effect that hunting has, especially when people think a bird is actually doing really well in numbers. So the Eskimo curlew, which is expected to be extinct, and which, I mean, I would say definitely is extinct, that was once one of the most common shorebirds in the whole of North America. And then around about the end of the 19th century, they started killing apparently about 2 million a year for subsistence hunting, and now they're extinct. So hunting is a huge issue, and I think that has been an issue in Ireland. But it's also just, as I say, it's the same issues as we have in the UK. There's issues with habitat loss, and despite Ireland being a stronghold for curlews, because it was considered a stronghold for curlews a few years ago, it's just completely dived. I'm not an expert into Ireland, unfortunately, but I think it's probably a mix of the two of them, the habitat, the same issues of the UK, the hunting. But I'm sure breeding waders like EIP know that have information about it online. And yeah, it's just the same kind of issues we have here, I think.
Yeah. Were they hunting them for food or just as pests, or what? Do you know? Do you know what was the reason behind that?
I think in more recent years it's more sports hunting.
Sports
But again,
hunting.
I'm not an expert on that. I don't think recent years. I mean, I guess curlew certainly, like all the species across the world, have definitely been hunted for food and have been considered to be a good food source. So maybe they were hunted for food, but I think certainly a lot of birds these days are killed for sports. Like you get the snipes and the woodcocks, they're often killed for sport. And they're not dissimilar to the curlew. So I reckon it's also largely sport hunting. I know that in France there's a moratorium on curlew shooting, but a lot of the hunters they just want to keep doing it because they think there are enough of them coming over. And I think again that might be a bit of both, but I think it is largely just sports hunting, or whichever it is. It's kind of like people have always done it, so they think they have the right to keep doing it. So it's probably a bit of a mix, but I'm not an expert as to whether that's still the case. I imagine these days it's more sports hunting that would be the issue
Yeah.
here.
And you mentioned that the Eskimo breed was under extreme pressure at the moment, and I know the slender-billed curlew is you expect it's extinct at the moment. I suppose what advanced that extinction maybe, and have we learned lessons from that species?
Yeah, so the slender-billed curlew, they announced in November it was 99.6% chance that it's extinct. Um, it's habitat loss as well, but it was also with the slender-billed, also hunting. So anyone who knows about the great auk extinction might tell you that one of the reasons, ironically, that the extinction was sped up was that when they became a rare bird, it was then even more exciting to have killed one and to have, a stuffed one, for example. So it then exacerbates the problem. And this was the case with the slender-billed. Even when they were quite close to their extinction, people were then going out to kill them because they were quite rare. So it's just like it's a bottleneck effect, really. But the exact reason for their extinction, from what I've read, isn't entirely known, but it's believed that hunting and habitat loss either were the reasons or worsened the reasons. But yeah, as I say, the Eskimo curlew was once one of the most common shorebirds in North America, and it was actually nicknamed the doe bird because it was considered such like a fatty bird to eat and like a good quality meat that unfortunately, yeah, millions and millions of birds. But in terms of whether we've learned a lesson from this, I think in a way we have. I think the most famous case, at least from what I've heard, is the passenger pigeon, which about 200 years ago, it's estimated there are about 6 billion of them in a region of North America, and they would darken the skies for days. And there were so many of them, billions, more than they had humans on the planet. They thought, we'll never be able to affect this population. We can kill as many as we want for food, or we can kill as many as we want for pest control. We'll never have an impact. And then 1914, they went extinct. And so I think we have learned lessons from that. Apparently, the passenger pigeon led on to us then bringing in more protections and being more aware of the impact we can have. It's just terrifying the impact we can have. In only about, I think it was 50 to 60 years, we went from having all those passenger pigeons to having none. So it's kind of the same thing here with the curlew. I think it does teach us a lesson. And I think now we're often dealing with the fallback of our behaviors decades or even 100 plus years ago. And we're now trying to undo the harm we've done in the past. But there are still a lot of issues. And even though we've learned the lesson, it's not just about now not killing them, it's about actually helping them again. Because if they've lost all these habitats or their numbers are low and they don't have a great genetic pool, then we actually need to do more to help them bring the numbers up again. And that can involve some work, even from people who aren't themselves conservationists.
Yeah. Catherine, lots of questions coming in.
Lots of questions, so we'll try and get through them, Flo. Just a really important one that I know came in before you talked about the trees, but it's from a farmer and who's obviously passionate, interested in curlew, but is asking, would it not make more sense to release the extensive land for native woodland, and that the curlews could adapt? So can you just confirm the position with the trees and the curlew again, please?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what the question was. You're saying
The question is, could curlews adapt to native woodland?
Okay. I would say if we had thousands and if we had millions of curlews, with evolution, they always have like some will behave in a certain way, and if they survive and pass on their genetics, then it'll, keep going down the lines. But if we had a lot of curlews, could they adapt? I just think it's not something that could be done easily within a lifetime of a curlew successfully enough that they would then have enough chicks for the problem to kind of be reversed. We don't have enough curlews to be giving them anything but the best chances, and a few maybe would adapt, but it wouldn't be enough to really help turn the tides, I don't think.
And you had a very striking figure there that the curlew won't nest within 500 meters of
Yeah,
or
yeah.
woodland. So I think that's the answer at the moment, because I think, there's a general, I know I'm talking about general biodiversity, and people often mistakenly in the, trying to do the right thing, say we leave that acre for everything, but that's not the way it works. Sure, it's not. So if a curlew won't nest within 500 meters of a tree, that's a figure I think we all need to remember.
Well, I would say it's more like I wouldn't say it's like a tree, and I don't think that's what you meant necessarily anyway, but it's like a forest. And the thing is, even if a curlew was to adapt and nest right next to a forest, it then brings a predation risk. So if they do adapt, I doubt they would then survive to then pass that behavior on. So even if we then have curlews near trees, there'll just be more curlews dying, and you don't have the time to kind of have them actually adapt to that properly, because without the predation risk going away, they would just be killed.
I think we've had great work on that in Ireland. We have a lovely webinar there with Catherine Finney on the Curlew EIP, and again came out with that figure, which I think really struck home to people about the predation and the curlew. And now we have Owen Murphy and the Breeding Waders EIP doing fantastic work, just getting going now and all that side of it. So what you've said really adds to the story there. I think everything you said today. So delighted with that. Just a question here that the climate, what is good for climate? The another kind of an issue that I'm constantly aware of, that the general assumption that what is good for climate change is automatically good for biodiversity. And you mentioned the trees and the forestry there is not good for curlews. But the question here is, are there some ways in which climate solutions might actually are there other issues that you're aware of with concerns about climate change and biodiversity, or climate solutions, that they might conflict with biodiversity?
Where the conflict? I mean, I'm sure there are. But certainly the trees is the most obvious one, because a lot of people think help nature, plant a tree, and that can be great. It's just about where you do it. Other concepts.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
For example,
I just want to get through.
Things like green energy, wind farms are green energy, but they do pose an issue. And like all sorts of green energy, there are pros and cons. It's green energy, but there are still certain risks. And so wind farms are an issue. It's just as to whether, do the positives outweigh the negatives. So I think that would be one way. It's not a solution, but it's like green energy is positive, but also it doesn't come.
Always positive. We need to think of. It's like the argument for even within biodiversity, we need to be careful of a single species focus. You could go after one, but you need to think, is it doing harm to it? So, listen, I have lots of questions, Flo, so if we can just get through some of them. Snipe. Somebody wondering, is snipe related to curlew?
I mean, they look very similar, and they're waders, but they're not a type of curlew. They'll be related somewhere back, but they're not come under the curlew. So you get jack snipe, common snipe, woodcock, curlew. They kind of look quite similar, but they're not the same type of bird.
Very good. Crows are very clever, we know that. So do they not to learn where the fence around the nest is a good place to find food? Do you get me?
No, I totally. Well, actually, I don't know so much specifically about the fencing, because I know that fencing isn't always it doesn't really stop them anyway. But first of all, if it's like a small area, it could be harder for the crows to get to anyway. But I was actually looking online at an article which was like questions and answers from farmers, and it was farmers saying, instead of not mowing my field, could I just put up like a flag next to the nest, or just leave like a meter of grass around the nest, so that I'm protecting the nest but still able to cut the field? And the answers were actually no, because the predators, whether crows or foxes, will think, there's a flag there, or there's a tuft of grass there, I better go investigate, and then they find the nest. So even probably is the case of fencing as well, which is why it's considered to be against mammals, not against birds, and also why electric fencing is better, because it is potentially an issue. But then if you don't fence them, they're then not protected against foxes and potentially against sheep and against trampling by cows as well. So it's kind of like you win some, you lose some. But definitely they do notice things like that.
Very good. And again, staying with the fences, what are your experiences with electric fences in relation to curlews flying into them and dying from it? Not, I suppose, from the shock, but from getting caught in them. Is there any worry about curlews flying into fences?
I haven't heard about it. I mean, it's certainly possible, but no, I haven't heard about that. I think a lot of it depends, like, as well, like some, if it's a field that's fenced off, it'd be a bit different to just around the nest. But if it's electric fencing, it doesn't have to be that tall. So a curlew's probably not coming in too fast, like quite low on the ground. But they'll often, if they don't want to make it clear where their nest is, they're probably not flying like straight into it anyway, especially when the chicks are walking around. Like, they're not always in that area. So once the chicks hatch, they won't actually be going like into the fence anyway, the fenced area. But I haven't heard about that, but I mean, anything's possible. But I certainly have not heard that in these discussions. I've never heard anyone say this happened to me. But it's definitely a valid question. I'd say it's worth looking into.
Are they solitary birds or will they nest in groups if possible?
So males tend to be quite territorial, but they are loosely colonial in their nesting. So like they will nest all in like a field, for example, if there's like enough space and enough resources. But if a male lands too close to like another male's area, he will likely chase them away. It's more in winter when they're not competing for nest space. You'll see like a lot of them together. In summer, like they'll kind of you can get a few in an area, but they won't be bunched right next to each other. They're not like some birds which will nest right beside each other. They like a bit more space, but they know if they see others that it's probably like a good area for nesting.
Yeah, again, some very complimentary comments on your presentation, and
Thank you.
absolutely fantastic, Flo. Some other questions, again, some comments about hunting has nothing to do with it, and the move from making hay to silage was the biggest cause of decline here in Ireland. That's just a comment from somebody.
Okay.
Um, uh, I see overwintering flock of 50 birds feeding in dairy farm field each year, normally at the start of February. Across the river from the field is a large expanse of rushy fields. Would the curlews be likely to roost in the dairy fields overnight or in the rushy fields?
Hmm.
Improved grassland, has it any benefit for a curlew?
From what I've read, they prefer unimproved.
Yeah.
So yeah, just probably what you'd expect. But yeah, as for which I don't know. I know because I do like wader dazzling, and that's not a curlews, but they very much like stubble fields for overnight. That's where they seem to spend a lot of their time. Um,
And a nice comment here, you mentioned the crane fly is an important source of food for them. Their larvae is the leather jacket, an agricultural pest that can seriously damage grassland. I think grease seeds in particular is Nicole. And this
Yeah.
might be a good motivator for some farmers when convincing them to help protect them. Comment on that. And
yeah, I like that. I like that.
yeah. We'll use every trick up our sleeve, won't we? Does the head starting has have any negative effects on the mother's birds? Stress or laying eggs again?
Mm.
Negative effects on the mother birds, yes.
Yeah. So of course it causes stress, like yeah, definitely. But at the same time, if that nest is almost definitely doomed to failure, it's like welfare wise, not great for the female, but also it's about survival, and it's not we can't focus on, just being kind to the individual. We have to look at the whole population and its survival. But also if an egg or a clutch of eggs is taken away, they will tend to lay again. Generally, it's found with second clutches or even third clutches, they're often kind of lower quality than the first because you think of the energy that goes into these eggs, like their body weight can be 40% eggs, the female. So it's a lot of energy they're putting into them. So the second clutch is probably lower quality and they're probably a bit more worse condition themselves at that point. But if there is any chance of that nest surviving, then it means we've got one clutch which is being head started and will almost definitely survive, and one clutch which is being reared in the wild and may survive. But often, as I say, with airfields in England, they're removed from places where they would definitely be killed otherwise. So again, it's really just a judgment as to whether you think that nest has the chance of surviving or not. But we need to focus on numbers at the moment.
You mentioned crumbling eggshells. How much of an issue is this and what is the cause?
So I think in the past it's like pesticides, but I know that's something that's being kind of looked in at the moment by the Curlew Recovery Partnership. I don't know much about it myself. I actually meant to look at that before I started because I was looking at the kind of main things that are being focused on, and I was thinking like I listed some things, and I was like, oh, I know there's another one. I looked up, I was like crumbly eggshells, but I meant to actually look at exactly what the cause was. But I know the Curlew Recovery Partnership are looking into that, and we have some studies on that in our page. But I think yeah, it could be various things. Like if it is diet and if it is like pesticides, then that's something which in the past we know is linked to crumbly eggshells. But yeah, that's something you can find out about either Curly Recovery Partnership or our website.
Would the return of the white-tailed eagle be a predator for the curlews?
Hmm. Possibly. I mean, they predate on so many things, but then at the same time, I say like someone I was speaking to said that if we had a land which was more biodiverse, there'd be more of every species. So long term, there would actually be no more risk to the curlew because they would have more to predate on themselves that weren't curlews, and there would be enough curlew that there could be a balance. So they certainly could be. But they often go for larger species as well. Like they can go for geese and things like that. So if they can go for something larger, they will tend to prefer to go for something larger if they can.
Just wondered about badgers and their impact.
Yeah, badgers will eat eggs on the ground, definitely. Yeah. And there's a video somewhere of like a curlew trying to lead There's one of a sheep, I think there's one of a badger as well, like trying to lead away from the nest, because they'll try and distract from the nest and lead them away. But badgers are very strong and can just kind of plow through, and yeah, they will eat pretty much anything they find. And I think they would eat chicks as well if they found them on the ground. Yeah, even hedgehogs will eat eggs, or sometimes even chicks that you found on the ground. So yeah, they can be an issue too. But then again, electric fencing would easily keep them at bay.
That's nature. That's nature, isn't it? And it's a natural, most natural. Can you tell the difference between a male and female curlew?
Yeah, so the females are generally larger and they've got longer beaks. It is kind of hard to tell otherwise, if they're not side by side, it's harder to tell. But the males and females will both incubate the eggs for like 3 or 4 hours at a time and then will go off to feed. But when it comes to the actual rearing after the eggs have hatched, that will generally be the male. So if you're seeing one adult with the chicks, that's probably the male. The female might hang around a little bit, but it is generally the male that does the rearing.
Very good. And last one from me, Cathal, was what time of year do people need to be particularly careful not to disturb the curlews?
So between March and July is the kind of like now onwards until the end of July is when you need to be especially careful. This is because even before they have their chicks, be pre-breeding, choosing nest sites, which they don't want to be frequently disturbed on, and then obviously having the chicks as well. And they need as much time as possible without this disturbance because of the risk of predation and all the things I've mentioned. But also I think it's important to remember that it's not just about the breeding season, it's also winter as well. So as I said in my talk, like in the wintering season, if they get frequently disturbed, as they often do, this can cause them to lose body condition, especially if they've just migrated or will migrate, and can mean that they lose weight. And then next breeding season, they're in a worse condition to start with and are less likely to be successful in their nesting. So, I mean, all the time really, but March to July is sort of the main nesting period in terms of when we need to start thinking about this kind of thing.
That's brilliant, Flo. Back to you, Cathal.
Excellent. So unfortunately, we're just coming up to the end of the webinar, Flo and Catherine. So we're going to have to leave it there. But I suppose, Flo, thanks a million. That was a super interesting presentation. You've slightly frightened us, particularly with our figures in Ireland here. But maybe that's the sense of urgency we need to put action in place. And I think that's where we need to start putting the right measure in the right place to try and protect the species going forward. Just like to thank everybody for submitting their questions, some really interesting questions. And thanks a million, Flo. Really enjoyed it. Catherine, thanks a million again for helping out with questions today. And also Yvonne in the background doing all the work there, making sure the webinar is running smoothly. So thanks a million, Yvonne there. Just to let you know, next week we can look forward to a chat with Dr. Patrick Forrestal, Research Officer in Teagasc, and Dr. Aoife Egan, Catchment Scientist with the Waters EIP. And next week we're going to discuss plantain power, reducing nitrate leaching in pasture systems, not to be missed either. So do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. But until then, I hope you have a great weekend and slán go fóill.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.